Dr. Jess Venner didn't start her historic journey as many would think. It actually started midway through a university marketing degree when she picked up a book. She was then hooked on learning more about some of the most famous women that have changed history. She is now a woman with a strong hand in unearthing the history of Pompeii, Italy, a city that was built at the base of Mount Vesuvius and was most famously frozen in time when that volcano erupted in 79 AD. What she is learning about the civilization will leave you fascinated by just how our modern-day civilization was shaped in so many ways by our ancestors so long ago, and how far, or not so far, we have come. Now, let's get to business. Hello, everyone. I am your host, Tatiana Ryan, and today I have with me such a special guest that we have had to delay you a couple times because you've been off doing your Indiana Jones kind of things. But today I have with me Dr. Jess Venner from Pompeii. We're going to be talking about a lot of history.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I am so excited for this talk because we have been watching all of the new revelations, all of the findings that are coming out of Pompeii right now, and you're going to give us the backstory on a lot of it.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that. I'm very excited to talk about it always, of course.
Oh, good. How did you get into archaeology, anthropology, the history of Pompeii itself?
Yeah, so I actually started life in marketing. I used to do marketing for TV and that sort of thing, and started doing my MA. Well, actually, I was doing my BA in publishing and discovered a book about the women of ancient Rome. And I thought, this is absolutely amazing. I'd never done anything like that before, really. So said to my mum, I want to do this instead. And she was like, absolutely not. You have to continue your BA.
Really?
Which is good advice, I think. So I finished that. And then when I started in my career, I sort of did an MA part-time. So in the evenings, working on classical civilization and discovering all of that. So worked really hard at that and then realized I was quite good at it. So decided to sort of self-fund a sabbatical for myself. So quit my job and went to Pompeii and around the UK and learned lots about archaeology and got lots of training, did Latin courses, did archaeobotany courses. So that's where you're sort of combining archaeology with botany. So uncovering plants and seeds and seeing what people ate, basically. And then I got a job at the British School at Rome, which studies all of this stuff. And then a year later, I was offered 2 scholarships, actually, but took one to do my PhD. So, and then here I am. So I've sort of started out just because Pompeii is absolutely incredible. Obviously, we all love the stories that come out of Pompeii, but started studying their gardens and how they were designing them, what they were doing in them, and realized that there was this whole new world of people creating gardens to grow food from and sell it and do it for their own fun, basically, inside their back gardens, vineyards and orchards and everything. It was amazing. So yeah, so that's basically, and now I'm here.
Well, so, all of that is going to delve into our conversation as to how they lived, but also your background in marketing too, and how people did business and how farmers sold food and how people ate, because that's a big one right now that we're finding. I just saw of how people kind of ate on the run too in Pompeii, didn't they?
Oh, they did. Yeah. So if you were rich, you ate at home in the privacy of your own home. And if you were poor, you would eat out, which is kind of the opposite of what we do now, I guess. So you would go to a fast food restaurant and you would buy something from the front counter. And I'm sure everyone's seen them with the dahlia in the front. So these are the big jars. and they would keep food in there, hot and cold. We also know that they were keeping hot like wine and things in there, like stews. So you grab those. You might sit in their back room to eat it with your friends, do a bit of gambling, catch up on the latest gossip. You might sit in the garden. Some of them in Pompeii had vineyards as well, so you'd sit under the shade of the vines, a bit like a pub garden. So yeah, so they were always out and about and socializing, definitely.
Now, talk about the structure of Pompeii. As you had said, the gardens were a very big part of it, but the decision to make a city at the bottom of a volcano.
I know it seems a bit crazy these days, although people still live there. So, so essentially, Pompeii was founded, we think, around the seventh century BC. It might actually go back to 9th century BC, which means it's like 3,000 years old. So there's been recent evidence to suggest that actually it was locals that founded it, because we're not sure if like the Greeks or the Oscans, which were another local people, or even the Samnites who came later in the 5th century BC, if they founded it. So it was a bit of a mix, and there were Greeks in there as well. But someone recently found a tablet that had the new Syrian alphabet. So Nocera is a local town to Pompeii. It's mentioned on maps with Pompeii at the time, which is amazing. So this alphabet is very, very local, which means that those people were in Pompeii as early as, 7th or even earlier century BC. So yeah, the reason to do it there, they knew it was fertile. They were a very agricultural community, but they didn't actually know that Vesuvius was a volcano. Some writers at the time had inklings. They were noticing sort of burning pits, they would call them, and they were thinking like, what's going on there? But they didn't actually know it was a volcano. So to them, it was totally fine. It was just a fertile place to grow food, and right by the sea, right by a river. So it's perfect for trade. You could jump in a boat and take your trade all around the world, and they did. So to them, it was great. It was a good distance to Rome, so you didn't have to travel days and days and days to get there. So yeah, so to them, there wasn't any problem. But people did actually, start living there after the eruption as well, because it was so fertile and so good for making money. So, you can't stop them. You can't stop them living there.
Well, you brought up the timeline of possibly being as far back as to the 9th century BC, but also the distance to Rome and the power that Rome had at that time. Getting involved with all the different countries around the Mediterranean also. What importance did Pompeii play in all of that? And was it more of a working community, or was it maybe like a suburbanite community where a lot of the rich people lived?
It was a real melting pot. There was all sorts of kinds of people there. We do have everybody from every social strata, really. So we have very rich, wealthy people living in villas, but also around the town, but also inside the town. And this is what's coming out of the excavations now, right? We've got these amazing, wealthy properties. It was a very political community. I'm pretty sure that Julius Caesar said, if you've survived politics in Pompeii, you'll be fine in Rome. I'm sure I read that somewhere, because it was so ruthless for politics, and they were so involved in that. But yes, it was a sort of everything, really. They had a lot of workshops there. They had a lot of traders that would travel, like I say, via the rivers and the sea. They had good links with Egypt as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about, because there's been so much on that as well. So yeah, a little bit of everything, really. It was a melting pot of different cultures and ethnicities and social strata and wealth. It was everything, really. So it was great. It was and it's perfect for studying, because then you get a bit of everything, really.
You just touched on it, the politics in Pompeii and what Julius Caesar had said. And there were some really weird laws going on that kind of we're delving into today with some of the shows we are seeing, like Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, that are so popular, but are, while they have that fantasy aspect to them, they are very politically charged.
Yeah, no, they were. It was a huge part of Pompeian life. So if you take a walk around Pompeii today, even, you can see graffiti on the walls absolutely everywhere. And these are campaigning for a person to be elected into office. So there'd be 2 a year that you'd want to elect. And it was a huge, huge deal. They had to put so much money into this. But also they would want to, well, you've probably heard the term bread and circuses. So they would give out free bread and they would give out free games. So like gladiatorial games in the amphitheatre. That was huge with the populace, and it would ensure that they would get the vote. But they would also enlist the help of local groups as well. So more recently, I've just looked at sort of something as specific as fruit sellers in Pompeii who were campaigning for politicians in the city, and they're writing on the walls, United Fruit Sellers call for this politician to be voted in. So everybody was involved in this. It affected everybody. So they were very, democratic in that sense. They took it very, very seriously. So yes, and you see their influence all around the town. They have, got dedications or inscriptions that say, this politician did this for the people. There's even an example of a young boy who rebuilt the Temple of Isis in Pompeii, and it was pretty much the first thing that was restored after a big earthquake in the city. So he would have had ambitions to be a politician. This would have done him really good early on. That was great for him. So his family were obviously doing that. But we do have women as well who weren't involved in politics because they couldn't be. But we have a lady called Eumakia who donated a building inside the Forum, and that's incredible because she's a woman, and that is such an important location in the city. So it sort of went across, even if you weren't in office, it went across all of Pompeian society anyway.
That is absolutely amazing that they're finding all this stuff now.
Yeah, there's all sorts coming out. I mean, the inscriptions are one of the best ways to find out who people were and give names to them. But yeah, as obscure as fruit sellers, we can tell who they were supporting and when. It's quite incredible. And we can link that up to the election results that we have that are listed somewhere. Not all of them, but we have most of them. So we can tell when they were getting into office as well. So yeah, it just shows you how fruitful it is to study Pompeii.
Well, you had talked about your background in marketing and marketing all of these politicians, but also the new findings that they're finding. One specifically is the frescoes and the blue room. Talk about that.
Yeah. So the blue room is a sacrarium. So it was sort of a private temple. I don't want to use that word, but as a sort of sacred room where you would carry out these religious or dedicatory ceremonies to the gods. So households would have their own gods and you would worship them at a shrine, which was called a lararium. And this was sort of an extension of that. And your clients might come as well. So you would have patrons and clients in Roman society. And the patrons were obviously higher than the clients, and the clients would come and visit them every day, at the salutatio, which is in the morning, a morning meeting, and sort of chat, or they would ask for advice, or they would get a favor from them. It was a two-way thing, really. And then, of course, if you were running for office, perfect, you'd get your clients to vote for you. So you had all of these, and they were sort of an extended family in a way. They might be using that room as well, but this blue room is quite something because the colour of it is so rare, and it's really only ever used in situations like this, which is why we think that it's a sacred room. I mean, I get a lot of people say to me, archaeologists have found something, it must be religious, but this one actually, there's a lot of evidence to point towards the fact that it was, especially you can sometimes tell where they're positioned in the house as well, because there are patterns. It's just like we would have in our own houses. You know where the kitchen tends to go, you know where the dining room tends to go. It's the same sort of thing. And of course, they found oyster shells in the threshold, and they were being used to restore. And a lot of this was going on at the time of the eruption. It was 17 years after the major earthquake that I mentioned earlier, which was in AD 62 or 3. And that destroyed a lot of the town, and there were still restoration works going on. We had so many tremors running up to the eruption as well. So today we would know that that's telling us an eruption's about to happen, but they weren't quite sure of that. So this is another piece of evidence to say restoration was going on here, even if it was minor. So yeah, there was all sorts going on in that little room.
You bring up the religious factor, but how does that tie into like today, how religion has, I mean, like you just said, the use of this blue and, were they wealthy did they keep all of their riches within the religion itself? There's so
Mhm.
many questions that people have as to how life was back then.
Mm. Religion was all pervasive in Roman society. It would have affected everybody. Um, we have evidence of little um, sort of like dolls or little figures that are kept by people, even slaves, that they would have really cherished. And then you've got all the way up to, like I was saying, with the young boy that was dedicating and rebuilding the Temple of Isis. That's incredible. That's such an involvement from a young age as well. But it was all throughout their lives. So as I mentioned, we'd have the Lararia inside the house, the little household shrines with little figures inside them, and we've found loads of them throughout Pompeii. So we've also got dedications inside the shrines. So they're mostly sort of plant materials, but we have had like piglet bones and things as well in those that they were giving. Pieces of egg, things like figs and olives were common as well, because olives are so common anyway. So they'd be doing this regularly. It was probably a slave that would be responsible for it, to do those dedications on a regular basis inside the house. But you'd also have neighborhood shrines as well. So a bit like you find in Europe a lot. You'd have the street would have their own shrine that they would be responsible for looking after, and then of course you'd have the temples, and they all were dedicated to their particular gods. Jupiter being the main one, usually in the Forum, and then you'd have all of the others. Again, like I said, Isis, she was over there, but she was very, very important because she was being restored straight away after the earthquake. So she was clearly very important to the town of Pompeii, and we think there was a fair amount of Egyptians potentially living in Pompeii, or second generation or third generation. So yes, but it went throughout society, and actually it was also a way for freedmen, so people that had been slaves and been freed, to rise up in society as much as they could. So the Augustales were worshipping Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome, previously known as Octavian, and he would be worshipped by these. So there's actually a temple for them, for this cult, in Herculaneum, which is very lovely. So I encourage everyone to go and Google that now. And they're still doing work on it, but you could grow up the ladder as a freedman. You couldn't go into office, but this was as high as you could get, and it was a very important cult. So they were often involved in that. So yeah, so it was something for everybody, I think, in religion.
From religion into technology.
Mm-hmm.
And how long, and you had mentioned we're going to get to the Egyptians in a minute and all of those findings, but also how long it takes technology to become a main everyday source. At what we take for granted in indoor plumbing, how long it took them to make aqueducts and bring all that water. As you said, they had to find a place that was near a river so that they could have the source there. And then taking that technology into everyday. What are you finding with that also?
Yeah, so it's really interesting in Pompeii. We've got a good idea of who had water supply inside the town. I think it's something between about 90 and 124 or something houses had their own water supply, which isn't a great deal when you think about how many people were living in Pompeii and how many houses there were. I mean, the population probably reached about 20,000 people. So that's not a lot. It was a real privilege to have something like water. And that was a big, big technological advancement. And of course, the aqueducts developed over time and potentially, definitely increased around the time of Augustus. And he had a lot of involvement in developing, Rome as a unified entity. So technology definitely advanced then. And of course, you had a lot from the Greeks, and they took that on and developed it. You have things like hypercaust, which is underfloor heating, which, is just, it still blows my mind when I see these. They're sort of stilts, brick stilts underneath the floor, loads of them lined up with gaps in between. and you'd obviously then have the mosaic floor on top, and there would be a furnace, and you'd fire the furnace, or a slave would, and the heat would go under and in between these gaps, and it would heat the floor from below. So that was really common to find in a bar, because you would want the hot room to be warm, and that's how they did it. It would also heat water as well. That was a good way of doing it. But I actually recently on my TikTok spoke about automatic doors. This is incredible as well. So, this was in the 1st century AD. A man called Heron, who was a mathematician in Alexandria, which we know of very well because of the library, created automatic doors for the temple, which is just crazy. There was a cylinder that was underneath a furnace. Again, they'd have a furnace in a temple, and then it would heat up, and it would be on a pulley system that would pull the doors open automatically. I mean, it's just incredible. Yeah, it's mad. So, but these things, did develop over time, definitely increased in the imperial period. So, like I say, from the time of Augustus, so you've got sort of the 1st century AD, it really started to accelerate, and more people had it. It was less so a thing that only the elite would have, and then it was less so a thing that only the very wealthy would have, and so on and so forth. But yes, even like I say, even down to having water in your house was a luxury and showed how important you were, because of your access to technology, I guess.
Well, okay, let's start delving into the different people that came along and had so many hands in not only Pompeii, but Rome. And Cleopatra, obviously, is a big one from Egyptian history because of her relationship with the leaders of the area. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing so much coming out of Egypt right now with Dr. Kathleen Martinez.
Oh, yeah.
How excited do you get doing what you do and seeing what she's doing?
Do you know what excites me the most is that it's women doing it? I'm just absolutely buzzing about that. I think that's just the best bit about it. And, even yesterday, another Egyptologist, Zahi Hawass, came out and said, I'm calling off this search because I've been doing this. It's just classic. A woman's been doing it for years and has made such advancements, and she was laughed at for her theories to begin with, to do with Cleopatra's tomb. And now, well, surprise, a man's coming out and saying, oh, no, it's my thing, and like everybody knows, Cleopatra only wanted a woman to find it, right? She alluded to that. No man will ever find it. It's, so yeah, I that's the bit I find most exciting. And actually, but it's just, it gets me so excited anyway, because it's so lovely to see the funds being put into this sort of thing, because it costs a lot of money to do this. So, in Pompeii, we've had to wait a long time to make sure that we've got the technology and the storage and the understanding to look after it once we excavate it. We don't want to just treasure hunt as happened, in the Victorian period. So, I think it's just really comforting as an archaeologist and a historian to see that it's all being done properly and taken very seriously. And also the information is being made more accessible. So young historians in particular can take an interest and use that to grow their own, research as well. There's a lot more of a collegial environment going on, I think, in history now than there used to be, which is great. But yes, stuff like this is the dream, isn't it? For historians. Yeah.
It is very much so. But as I said before, do you think a lot of these newer entertainment empires are helping kids get involved and the younger generation to have an interest in history and in what you guys are finding? Like, we had Indiana Jones in the 80s and 90s, and now we have Game of Thrones, where everybody's really starting to get interested in the history and how these families grew and the timelines and all of that.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely do. I think it does glamorize it, but it is, to me, it is a glamorous, lovely thing to be in. Actually, I do really think that it's as exciting as it can. I mean, you're not jumping and chasing naughty people that are stealing things, well, hopefully anyway, but it is as exciting as it seems. There's a lot in between of sitting at a desk and researching and trying to find things out. But I always describe it as it's like being a detective. You're putting together pieces of information. And I think younger audiences now having access to that information, like I said, and like you said, especially with, popular culture as well, it makes it more appealing, but more accessible as well. I didn't come from an education where this was an option. I didn't do ancient history or classics. I definitely didn't do Latin at school. So this was something that came to me much later. It was almost like it wasn't for me. And I'm hoping that people like myself and other like Dr. Martinez are making it more accessible, and you can do this as a viable career option. So hopefully, yes, I hope so. But yeah, like it is as lovely as it and exciting as it seems. Definitely.
You just brought up, your job isn't necessarily chasing after grave robbers and things of that sort, but a lot of times, so like you'll see these antiquities and the physical items you find do end up on black markets, and we've seen in history being hidden away from the people that should have it and be able to see what has actually gone on in history. But you do at times do have to deal with that kind of stuff.
You do, yeah, unfortunately so. And it's still going on in I know that it still happens in Italy. And obviously the locals are really not happy about this. This is their heritage. This is something that it's a complete debate anyway of where artifacts should end up and where the line is. And these things do belong where they should have been. So I do think it's a real shame. And, I remember being, when I was digging in Oplontis, which is a villa next door to Pompeii, and the empress who was married to Nero, who we all know, Poppaea, she is supposed to have had this villa. This is supposed to be her villa. So I was digging there and I heard a little anecdote of somebody who said an Italian man nearby was redeveloping his house and happened to come upon a room, that's all I know, that was, essentially well preserved, a bit like at Pompeii. And he decided to speak to, this was quite some years ago, decided to speak to some Americans who wanted to buy it. I feel like they were in New York or somewhere. They bought the whole room. This is all on the black market. And then he was able to fund his move to America and start a pizza chain. So it's sort of like this really weird story, but that just shows you how this happens. It can sometimes happen without our knowledge of it happening, less so now. I think this was, 50-40 years ago, potentially, from memory. So, it happens less so because you can probably get away with it less. And we're more aware, authorities are more aware, and there's a lot more laws in place to protect these things. But yeah, it shouldn't happen. I mean, it's much more valuable to be kept in the public domain, and people can learn from it and use it and enjoy it. But especially if it's kept in the country of origin, I think is very important where possible.
Pompeii was literally a city that was frozen in time from the volcano itself. And we're finding now, like I've said in the news, there was, I believe, either a military man or someone very wealthy that had a stable full of horses that were literally just frozen. Talk about that and the life itself and how it just stopped after that day.
Yeah. So it's a funny thing. It is frozen in time and it isn't. So the first thing is that there was a lot of destruction on the day of the eruption. The eruption happened sometime in the morning. We now think in October, 17th of October. And it was supposed to have happened in the morning, and then it sort of progressed until early next morning. So this happened over a day. So at first, of course, the eruption happened. Everyone saw it all go up into the air. A big, big column of ash and gas went very, very high. I mean, kilometers high. I think it's something like 18 times the Burj Khalifa or something crazy.
Really?
Very, very high. So you can only imagine this is getting heavier and heavier and heavier. So it's going to collapse at some point, which it does. But all the pumice is raining down. So there's a lot of chaos. Some of the pumice is massive. You might have seen in the news, one of the skeletons underneath a huge boulder because they've been crushed. It's
Wow.
taking out buildings, roofs, people. And also, of course, this is rising at a very high rate. So the pumice is getting higher and higher and higher, and it would eventually reach meters high, up to the second floor. So of course, that's happening. And as it gets more and more aggressive, then we have the pyroclastic flows, which are very high heat, it's sort of got, what's the word? Yeah, no, flows. Flows is
Mhm.
the word. Flows of gas and pumice and ash, very, very hot. I think it's like 500 degrees. And it's coming at a speed that you obviously cannot run away from. But again, this is taking out buildings and anything that's there. And this is kind of where we get the impression of people and animals like the horses being frozen in time, because what we have is them being hit by this flow and then falling where they fell, or sometimes they're still sitting up or covering their faces or covering their mouths because they're trying to not suffocate. And they're sort of stuck in that position. And this is mostly because of the heat kept their bodies in that position. You'll see it with, unfortunately, with fire victims sometimes, where their
Mhm.
bodies contract in the heat, and it's called the boxer pose, where their arms go up in front of them like a boxer. So you see that a lot in Pompeii, but they basically were preserved in these positions. And then the pumice fell around them, the ash continued to fall, and it would solidify around them and they would decay over time, and their skeletons would be left inside. And then later on, when archaeologists found their cavities that they were in, they filled it with plaster of Paris, and that's how we can see the forms that they were once in, because it was a bit like cement around the bodies where
Mhm.
they decayed. Um, but then in terms of the buildings that are relatively well preserved, the one that's coming out now, for example, there are parts of it that are essentially as they would have been, just because of the nature of how it was hit by the pyroclastic flows and the pumice and everything, preserving it as it was on that day. And the frescoes, paintings in particular, haven't been exposed to the sunlight in all of that time, and so they look as they did on that day, which is amazing with these new discoveries, because we're used to seeing much more muted colors from the frescoes because they were discovered so many years ago and they've faded over time, especially if they're still on site. But these ones are coming out and they are so incredibly vivid, and it just shows you that they absolutely loved color in Pompeii. Like, it was a bit in your face, to be honest. It was on the external walls inside your house, on statues were painted, so it was everywhere. But yeah, so it kind of was frozen in time and kind of wasn't at the same time.
Now, you said that people still live there. Talk to us about how life went on after that day. And you, like you said, you had people that were running for government. And then all of a sudden this happens. How do people move on from that? The ones that are still left there.
Yeah, it's yeah, no one really talks about it or thinks about it, actually, because you just think, oh, it was destroyed and that's that,
Mm.
which is kind of the case. So a lot of people that had escaped, and a lot of people did, um, they came back to try and find either relatives, depending on, because some of them hadn't realized how bad it got, or they were trying to find their buildings, or they were trying to find materials that they'd left behind. There were a lot of locked boxes with treasures inside the city that we found. So obviously these were being put away to come back to, which is really, really sad. So when they came back, it was basically at a level where temples and tops of buildings were poking out, a bit like a little graveyard of the ash, which over time, as the rain hit it, especially in weather, it was solidifying even more. So they were actually tunneling down into Pompeii to start with. So we have ancient tunnels inside the city, but we've also got tunnels from much, much later, hundreds of years later, of again, treasure hunters that had heard from locals the legend of Pompeii and tried to tunnel down and find treasure. So you've got it in two levels, and skeletons from both periods, actually post eruption, inside the tunnels have been found too. But after a while, it was too solid to dig into, so they gave up. But they did, in the meantime, sort of pillage marble and statues. I mean, the statues that were in the forum would have been stored inside, potentially because of the eruption happening, to protect them. And they took that. I think they were still there, actually, but the rest of the temple in the forum, for example, was just completely bare. So when archaeologists first found it, they were like, this is a weird temple. It's sort of brick and it's really ugly. No, they'd taken all the marble to reuse it. They were quite resourceful in that way. And then over time, so this stopped happening. A relief fund was actually set up by the emperor to help people that had been a victim of the eruption. And, that all went away. And eventually people did start to live like on or around the city in the years afterwards. But within, I think it was 100 years, Pompeii stopped being mentioned on the maps and started just being called city on the maps instead. Oh. So they knew there was something there from, local legend, but it sort of got lost and forgotten. And then after a while, it just wasn't spoken about again for hundreds of years, really. So it sort of just went. It's really sad.
That's very interesting, because you had brought up the being pillaged kind of just like Egypt was. Mm-hmm. And then coming back to it, hundreds of years later, people knew there was something there, but they did not have the technology to get at it until essentially now. Yeah, exactly. And of course, now we're very careful. If you find, columns, you're going to want to support them. But I'm not sure that they were, because they'll fall over without the support of pumice and things. But I'm not sure that they were very good at that. So, and they really were, the Bourbons who were searching for treasure were really just interested in finding the good stuff, things like jewelry and things like that. So anything else they just sort of discarded. And then later on, when the Victorians began excavating, they were kind of along the same line, like, this Victorian team were kind of along the same line of just looking for good stuff. And again, we've got very little records in certain houses of where things were found. And there's a lot of things in the Naples Museum, Archaeological Museum, that we don't know where they came from. It's just sort of location unknown, which is a shame, because a lot of what we know about things comes from context. It's very hard to understand certain objects if we don't know where they were or why they were there, who owned them, who commissioned them, that sort of thing becomes very difficult. So yes, it's still an ongoing issue, but obviously now we're very, very careful with it. We mark everything where it was found, what it is, take lots of records of that, and then preserve it properly afterwards. You said Pompeii was a melting pot, and obviously from where it is situated, you had many different people possibly traveling through it. Have you come across in what you do different areas that you can connect the dots and say, hey, this is Asian, or hey, this is obviously from this region? Have you ever been able to do that?
Yeah, so it does have, we've got a lot of religion's one of those, definitely. We have religion from, I think it's Lakshmi, the Indian goddess. A statue of her has been found. We've got a lot of Egyptian stuff. But it's mostly called syncretism, and it's kind of like the blending of religions. So the Romans were really, really good at doing this, and it also helped them to conquer, because it made what they were doing a little bit more acceptable, is for lack of a better word, because essentially they were like, oh, well, we're very understanding, we can take your gods into our temples, that's fine. So you get a lot of sort of different cultures being worshipped, or religions being worshipped in the same household even. So you've got sort of an Anubis statue in another house, and you've got Egyptian paintings on the walls. I mean, especially in gardens. So I specialize mostly in gardens, and how ordinary people lived. You get a lot of Egyptian motifs, definitely. There's a beautiful house called the House of the Ephebe, who they were sort of middle class, I guess. We think they were traders. They had a garden with a triclinium, so an outdoor dining, sort of three couch where you'd lie down, a bit like in the films, actually. And all along the walls and all on the triclinium were Egyptian motifs and scenes, so Nilotic scenes. You had little pygmies in there with sort of crocodiles and things. It's amazing, and all over the walls and things. So they would have sort of dined and reclined with their friends and maybe discussed the Egyptian scenes that were before them. And they may well have been Egyptian themselves, Egyptian immigrants that had come to Pompeii, or the prevalent theory is that they were traders that traded with Egypt because they were very, very important in terms of grain, especially. So it comes through all the time, especially in Pompeii. Yeah.
Well, you had just mentioned the synchronicities of how the politics was being, portrayed to everyone. Like, okay, well, if you like this God, we'll bring this God. Will you vote for us? That is absolutely amazing of how you're finding all of this and how it's intertwining and being able to connect the dots with people there, especially, as you said, not so much the rich, maybe the traders or the middle class or even the lower middle class.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, from an elite and upper class point of view, they would have been the generals in the army, and they would have been traveling in that respect. But you'd also have the traders and other lower sections of the military who were also traveling a lot. So they would have been put overseas, and so they might be familiar with these religions and these cultures firsthand, and they may want to bring that back with them. So we can't ever really tell for sure how it was being brought back. Was it being brought back by the people themselves that, from these countries, Egyptians, for example, or was it people that had been out, traders and military men that had gone and experienced it and then brought it back with them? So, we see this in Britain. We've got the gods coming over here, and this sort of slow adoption of, it's not that slow actually, it was quite quick, but an adoption of Roman gods, and they start to worship those alongside their own ones. In the Roman baths, we've got sort of curse tablets that mention these different gods, but they're, as far as we can tell, they're Britons. So it's, but the travel definitely, and I think again, this happened in the imperial period when there was so much more of Rome, conquering so much of the world, and the extended Mediterranean, that there was more opportunities to travel and bring these cultures back, along with things like exotic plants that hadn't, like peaches were initially not a thing, or citrus and lemons, which we'd associate with Italy, were being brought in. It was, but I would say that it was a mix, really. It was all classes were involved in travel and bringing this to Italy and Rome.
How important do you think technology is right now to finding out some of that history, especially like DNA, that the technology that is booming right now, to be able to find out so much about a human as to where they're from, or genetics and diseases and things of that sort?
So important, and especially at Pompeii and Herculaneum, because what's so unique about these people is they weren't killed from a disease or something else. They were all killed at the same time. So they provide a sort of snapshot of a society in one moment who were killed by an external force. So when you look at them, you can see how they were living, what they were eating, what their diet was like in terms of, how it was affecting their teeth. Or it's fascinating actually, because the skeletons in Herculaneum, there are 300 or so that were found in the boat sheds at the front where the beach was. And they're a mix of men and women, but we've got all sorts of ages, including children. And we can see what sort of they were affected greatly by malaria. And this makes sense because they were on the river. But they had a really good diet. So they had a diverse diet of, vegetables and fruits. They ate some meat, but not a great deal. We can tell that I think they ate a lot of pork. They relied on sort of chicken eggs and things, and had a lot of fish because, again, it was readily available. So we had all of that going on. I mean, it's so important in terms of skeletal evidence. But then we've got AI as well, which is telling us a lot about what was in the scrolls in the Villa of the Papyrus in Herculaneum. So this is, again, it's actually amazing how quickly this is going. And like I was saying earlier, getting people involved in that and making it more accessible is speeding the process up. And we're learning so much more from it. Instead of archaeologists and historians sitting on that information, we're getting a lot more out of it by making it more open to the public. So AI is another one. We've also got things, we're discovering temples all over the world, or buildings that we didn't know existed, because we're able to use penetrating radar that's looking at what's underneath. Again, technology is just smashing out of the park, to be honest. It's really, really important. But it also, the human value is still definitely there. Some people ask, what's the point? If AI can translate these papyri, or what, these tablets, whatever, then what's the point in humans? Well, there is always a point, because you need to interpret it. You need to understand the history behind it and the context, like I was saying earlier, of where it's found or who might have owned it. So there's a huge, it's only an aid, and I think it will continue to only be an aid, forevermore. It should be, because otherwise, if you remove the human element from history, then it's not history anymore, and that includes the people that are doing it right now. So yes, but it's a very exciting time, and also technology in terms of preserving it too, and making it accessible, making it digitally accessible to other people. These scrolls are being made accessible to others now, and this would have been kept in a library somewhere and not accessible unless you got a permit or whatever. So hopefully a lot more of us can enjoy more things because of technology and how fast we're finding things with it.
You brought up a really good point about Pompeii and the people there not being wiped out from such things as disease or anything, but it was a natural disaster, a cataclysm that just happened. Another historian, Jimmy Corsetti, is talking about a site in Africa that, is big, questionable as to how it was destroyed. Do you think Pompeii is a leader with bringing that technology and saying, okay, well, this was a natural disaster, so maybe you guys can learn from what we're doing here?
Yeah. Credit where it's due. The Italian people are so good at this. They take it so seriously, and they have such a lot of pride in what they do. And but I think also it helps that somewhere like Pompeii is so well known that the funding will naturally go there if there is that funding, or the people with the expertise will want to be trying to be associated with that, or contributing to it. So for more obscure sites, it's harder to get that momentum, and it takes longer, but it doesn't mean that they aren't as important. They're all providing different ideas of how people lived. There's a town that many people don't know about just outside of Rome called Ostia, which was a harbour town. There's a lot of information there. And again, it sort of tells us a lot about how a trading town operated, but it doesn't get spoken about as much. So, but, saying that, Pompeii and Herculaneum are really unique in the fact that they were kind of, as we said, frozen in time, and providing a snapshot. But some of them were some cities were abandoned quite suddenly, and you still have a lot of information there. Africa's really good for things like papyrus and tablets because of the preservation of them. Usually in sand. They're fantastic for that. We've got actual letters between people and all these amazing things that you wouldn't really get anywhere else. So I hope they start getting more attention. But it's just where the public eye goes, I guess, sort of does determine what happens with them to an extent. Um,
I have a question because as we just brought up technology and things being frozen in time and being able to date things, do you think sometimes that things are dated not as well, or they were not dated not as well as they are being found to be now, that they were much older?
oh yes, yeah. So yeah, we can do carbon dating on things. So this is another technological advancement. Um, I think that that is obviously getting more accurate. But there are things, like art, where there's still ongoing debates about chronology of how art has developed over time. I just read a book that was amazing about relief sculpture. Kurt Borgian, his name is, I think, I'm saying that right. And he talks about the fact that there isn't a chronology to develop here. We can't find one. We can't try to find a chronology because art, especially Romans and the Romans took influence from the Greeks mostly, and over time they sort of just went in and out, weaving in and out of what they wanted to use from history. So you can't establish a date from that always. Material is very important for that and the scientific advancements and what we can do there. But in terms of, actually, sometimes you have to have a broad bracket because you can't always really know. So I'm sure that will get better over time. I'm sure science will develop and we'll be able to tell that without damaging artifacts or skeletons or teeth or whatever to find this information out. The advancements are incredibly, fast at the moment. So I'm sure that we'll get much better at that as time goes on.
Well, delving more into what you do and as you had said, studying their gardens and possibly how they started building with materials from their gardens, and delving into the architecture of the area. What are you finding? Like a lot of times, here in America, we find 1800 houses that have horsehair plaster. What are you finding in maybe what they ate to what they built things with?
Sure. So, there's different regions in Pompeii, and there's two in the southeastern corner that I've mostly studied, and these are the ones near the amphitheatre. And this is basically where it's very, very green. I mean, Pompeii itself was about a third of it was green, which you wouldn't think now because you look and it's really grey, but it was very, very green. So they were relying heavily on their gardens to support their households, to support their income, and to support the local trade and just generally how the city was doing. But also in this surrounding area around the city, there was a lot going on there as well. They had farms, they had animals like cows and pigs that they would bring into the city for trade, or they'd move them in and out. But they would also use resources like trees. They would go out and cut them. So we found hatchets and things inside the city, along with lots of other agricultural tools that they'd be taking out to the countryside. Unfortunately, they were probably, again, slaves or very low wage workers, and they would be taking them out. And then at the end of the day, they'd come back in, stay in one of the houses and do the same again every single day. So they were a very, like I said before, resourceful community. And then after that earthquake I mentioned in AD 62 or 3, a lot of building materials were reused. A lot of the houses were sort of partially demolished in this area, so region 1 and 2, and then they started making new gardens so they could support town. And it was a bit like we had in COVID, where everyone started panicking and gardening and producing their own food. It kind of happened then as well. They'd sort of been cut off from their water supply, a lot of damage in the city. And they probably thought, what's the point in rebuilding these buildings in this section? We might as well make use of it for now, at least. So within the 17 years, they created so many gardens. There are about 30 gardens there that I've found that were created after the earthquake. So I think about 20 of them were created after the earthquake. So it's huge amounts going on there. They were so resourceful and they were supporting the local community. So yes, but in terms of building materials, they were literally getting the building materials, putting them in open spaces, and then sort of using them. I guess they would have sold them out to other people, and it was sort of just like a communal activity. Really, they were quite well organized.
You just brought up COVID and how history sometimes repeats itself over and over. Do you think we're learning lessons as we repeat ourselves?
I often find myself thinking, no, I don't think so. Unfortunately, a lot in politics, especially, looks very similar to, Roman times. We're destined to do that. Humans love to do that. We love to repeat things. We love to not learn from it and keep trying it out until it works. But no, I don't think we are really, not really. But I like to think that, I hope that we come back, and I think COVID did this a little bit. I hope that we come back to a more communal way of living, because the Romans were we've touched on so many ways in which they did that, with their religion or, entertainment or feasting or whatever. They were very communal people, very involved in their local communities and very patriotic. So, about their immediate communities, but also about Rome. So I hope that we come back to being more like that as a global community, working together and connected more to, the earth and things like that really matter. I know that people are becoming a bit more spiritual now, and these things come in waves. But I think it's all potentially, hopefully, going in the right direction. But that's, this, you could see it in Pompeii happening after the earthquake. They had an awakening in a way. And they thought, we can't carry on like this. We need to be more resilient. Let's build so that we can be more resilient. And we've kind of all done that as a global community as well, hopefully. Saying that, I'm not sure. It changes, doesn't it? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. You just brought up the entertainment and feasting. What have you found with Pompeians what was their favorite thing to do?
Oh, yes. Well, like I mentioned, they love a gamble. Love to gamble. Yeah. There's frescoes in the inns, basically like pubs, of people gambling and fighting over who's winning. It says it in sort of speech bubbles above them. So
they text messages.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, the Pompeii. But see, nothing much has changed. They did love to feast. It was a very, very important part of society. If you were or thought you were upper class, you would invite people around. You would spend a lot of time thinking about what you would feed these people and their menu. And actually, this even went down to sort of individual people. There's ancient writers, I think it was Martial, who was pretty annoyed that he'd been fed things that, a peasant, in his words, would be fed. He thought it was so insulting, because he was supposed to be he's a poet, and he was supposed to be a really good guest for this person, and clearly this person did it on purpose, like the equivalent of giving someone leftovers when you invite them around to your house. So they had a great sense of humor, and they loved to go to, the amphitheaters. We've seen in popular culture, especially, there were gladiator barracks in Pompeii. So they would have games. They were very passionate about this. They would write on walls who their favorite gladiators were and who was winning, and mark down the scores. And there was even a fight a few years before the eruption, and it was a really famous fight. And actually, the whole city, it was between Pompeii and a local town, and Nola, I think it was, and they actually, I think people died. People got, it was really, and there's an actual painting of this riot, the Pompeian riot, in someone's house. So it was really well known, and the emperor said, right, that's it. You're not holding any more games for years now. You're not allowed. We think that they were allowed in the end, but the point
they
is
just did it with that.
Yeah, they just did it. And well, actually, that is a very real possibility. I think they just did. They just got away with it. But they were so passionate about everything that they did. You can see it throughout the town in their graffiti and their paintings and what they like to do in the day. So yeah, but yes, but food was a big part of their day, definitely. and bathing, of course.
As you had just said, delved into the architecture of having the hot rooms where did they commune there, and was it part of the culture to bathe together, or because I know there was a Roman law I just looked up where they were taxing urine or something. It was something strange like that.
The vectigal urinae, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They realized that they could make a lot of money from it, and they used urine for washing clothes. So yes, they realized that actually, we should be taxing that. So they would put pots around the city, and people would wee in them, and then they would collect them and use them and sell them. So yeah, and then you'd go and buy some urine for your laundry. So yeah, a bit crazy, but yes, bathing was a huge part of the day. Annoyingly, women were charged more to go to the baths than men, but there was separate.
Yeah, it hasn't changed.
No, I know, it's standard. But they had their own baths. And they would go in, and you would have attendants even looking after your cloak. So you'd give them some money to look after it. Again, we've got a curse tablet in the Roman baths that says, whoever took my cloak, you're cursed now. Because clearly he didn't want to give the coins out to look after his clothes while he was in the baths. So then you'd go from that room, you get undressed, and then you go through. You might get a snack as well on the way in, and then you would go through the progression of the rooms: the hot, the tepid, and the cold rooms. And you'd have a little plunge in the swimming pool as well. So yeah, and like I say, they were heated from below, these rooms, and you might also get scraped down with a strudel by a slave. They'd put olive oil on you, and then they'd scrape it off. So you can imagine the dirt that would come off on this. But and yeah, so you'd come out feeling great. But it was a great place to catch up on gossip, because it was the place to be, and everyone would be there. But it was a very communal activity. But you did have private baths as well.
Now, in all of your time studying, what has been the most interesting thing you have ever, I guess, found to date?
Oh my goodness, that is such a good question. I would say it was the discovery that they started creating gardens in response to a real need in the city. But in terms of sort of people, I'm surprised all the time by the graffiti and what you can find out about people. It's the insulting ones that are my favorite, where they're just, slagging off this person or this person's. I love it so much. Or the romantic graffiti, where it sort of says, oh, I love this girl and she doesn't know, or things like that. I think they're the ones, when I come across them, that really do sort of get my heart going. I think they're really sweet. And another one actually is a shopping list on a wall in a house, which says, what they've bought for the week, and they sort of have dated them. And it's almost like they're marking out what they might need for those days, or what they bought on those days. We don't know. But they were buying things like bread and oil and wine, and occasionally some porridge, which was you'd eat in the morning. It's like a little gruel. And I think that's brilliant, because you can tell what they were eating, but they clearly thought it was important to mark this down, and God knows why they did it on the wall. But didn't have paper to hand, didn't have a tablet to hand, so they just popped it on the wall. So a bit odd. But these latest ones that are coming out, and we've got the graffiti of the gladiators on the wall. It's probably done by slaves. But even in the palestra, which is where they would have exercised, a big area next to the amphitheatre, you've got sort of writing quite low down on the wall, and it's children potentially practicing their writing, but it's very low down. I just think that's lovely as well. So yeah, it surprises me all the time. I'm sure I'll find something tomorrow that will surprise me even more, and that'll be my new favourite thing. So who knows what we'll keep finding, but like you say, with technology especially, we can understand a lot more about what we're looking at, and understand how they lived from that. And that's just, I can't choose, basically. It's the answer.
Well, you have so many amazing videos on social media right now. So where can everyone follow you?
Oh, yes. So I am Life in the Past Lane. So on TikTok and Instagram, I'm Life in the Past Lane _. And on YouTube, I'm just Life in the Past Lane. And then I've got my website as well, which is jessvenner.com.
Awesome. Jess, you have to come back if you find anything else out. And I'm so glad.
Course.
I'm actually kind of glad that we waited until after all
Yeah,
of this to do this recording.
meant to be, right? There's so much coming
Yeah,
out. Yeah, it's like it's mad at the moment, but definitely if anything else comes up, we can always have another chat.
we're definitely going to have to either way because you are so much fun. You are so knowledgeable. And this has been such an amazing conversation. I will link everything in the body of the podcast so people can get to you and your website and follow you on social media because you are so knowledgeable and they obviously need to go to Pompeii and
Of
visit
course.
and
Of
see
course.
all of this.
Yeah, definitely. Need any tips, you know where to find them.
Okay, I am Tatiana Ryan. This is the Businessy Podcast, and I was joined so wonderfully by Dr. Jess Venner in Pompeii. Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you so much. I've loved it. Thank you.
And you have a great day.
You too.